Good Tuesday evening, August the 1st, 2023. You are tuned into the Joseph Banami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Banami. Thank you so much for joining. Tonight, the U.S. Congress spaces out and holds whistleblower hearings on UFOs. I promised we'd do it last week, and tonight we're going to get into that. But before we do, here are the headlines that have caught my eye today. Just a few. Lots of headlines every day because the news is busy every day. But here's a few that caught my eye that I thought that you might be interested in. First of all, here in Ontario, apparently Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, called in a handful of senior political advisors to express his frustration with the two by-election losses last week in Scarborough-Guildwood, which is an urban Toronto riding that was previously held by the Liberals, and also a by-election in Kanata-Carleton, which is here, an urban riding, predominantly urban riding here in Ottawa, which was previously held by the Conservatives in Ontario, the Progressive Conservatives. And the whole question is, where did the Tories go wrong? Now, I read this story in the Toronto Star, and there were a whole bunch of theories that were posited. The timing of the by-elections was wrong, giving the Liberals, particularly here in Kanata-Carleton, too much time to get organized. What else were they talking about? They ran the wrong radio ads on the wrong topics. They should have run radio ads on healthcare, according to the Premier. This is what the report says, as opposed to the topics that they did run, and that was Ontario's growing economy and a healthy economy, etc., etc., etc. Okay. But there were two things that were immediately apparent to me from this report. The first is you cannot, in my judgment, because the Liberals won in Kanata-Carleton by just over 600 votes. When you're talking about a low number of votes like that, I think it's a mistake to dismiss, as apparently the political masterminds in Doug Ford's office have done, and that is the bleeding off of votes and the staying home. That's a very important factor as well, staying home of voters that traditionally would vote Conservative. So how many traditional Conservative voters would there have been had the Conservative Party been interested in wooing its base of support? This has been an ongoing issue for me over the years, and you've heard me talk about it on this show and elsewhere, and I've written about it, and that is, in this country anyway, the reluctance of Conservatives to actually try to attract Conservative voters on fundamental issues, fundamental Conservative issues. And one of the ongoing problems that we have in Ontario, as we see not just here in Ontario, but across Canada and in the Western world, is this ongoing wokeism. And there are a lot of parents that are up in arms about what's going on in our schools today. And the Tories here in Ontario, Tories, by the way, if you're listening from an international audience, is a nickname for Conservative Party, whether it's the Progressive Conservative Party or just plainly the Conservative Party. So that's what we call them. It's a nickname. We call them Tories. So the Tories here have been very reluctant to get into that, and they're afraid to. And I understand the fear, but at some point in time, you have to stand for something. And in fairness, there are many good things that the Doug Ford government has done, but not entirely conservative on fundamental issues. Okay. So I don't mean to say that as a criticism. I'm just making the observation that there was no discussion around any of those fundamental issues and the bleeding off of votes that ought to have gone to the Conservative candidate, particularly in Kanata Carleton. And, the number of votes, the vote collapse for the Conservative candidate was more than 10,000 from the previous election. That is partly due to the fact that it was a by-election. And of course, in all by-elections, the vote totals go down for everybody. But the vote total went down considerably more for the Tory candidate. So at some point in time, you have to ask, at least at a minimum, is there something we're doing to alienate our own supporters? And apparently, if the story in the Toronto Star was to be believed, that actually never came up in the meeting. Okay, so I wanted to get that off my chest, but you know what my biggest takeaway from this particular news item in the Toronto Star was? The biggest item that I took away from that report was that within days, within a day possibly, of the meeting being held, a confidential meeting in the Premier's office between the Premier and senior political advisors, 3 political advisors who were in that meeting, 3, or maybe I shouldn't say political advisors because that might be identifying people that actually didn't talk to the press, but let's just say the 3 people who were in that meeting talked to the media off the record, anonymously. Now, I think that that's a huge red flag. If alarm bells are not going off in the Premier's office this morning, having read that report and reading that 3 people who were in that meeting spoke to a reporter about the deliberations anonymously, okay, if you're not, I don't want to say in panic mode, but if you're not outraged and ready to drop the axe, then there's something seriously wrong. That is an indication of terrible dry rot within the political establishment, within the conservative political establishment in Ontario. It's extremely unprofessional, and we're not talking 1, we're not talking 2, we're talking 3 people actually going to the press. So they either did that without the Premier knowing about it, which is why they spoke anonymously, or they did it with the Premier's consent, which is problematic enough. I don't know what the situation was there, but it did happen. So that's a serious problem. I don't know how the Premier plans on addressing it. I don't know how high the problem goes, so I don't even know that the actual political leadership, the administrative leadership of the political party itself, the president of the party, etc., campaign managers, I don't know how high it goes. I don't know who spoke to the press, but whoever did, it was terribly wrong, and we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen. In Alberta, Madam Justice Barbara Romaine finally issued a ruling in a case that was brought in December of 2020 by 2 churches and a gym owner who were arguing that pandemic-related public health measures, that is to say, shutdowns, mask and mandates, vaccine mandates, etc., were a violation of Alberta's Bill of Rights and an unlawful breach of the charter rights of the individuals who brought the case. So the judge in the case, Madam Justice Romaine, found, no surprise here, that the restrictions were amply and demonstrably justified, that's a quote, amply and demonstrably justified under the Charter because of the nature of the unprecedented public health emergency. Now, I've had discussions with many of my friends and some of my colleagues within the conservative community who continue to talk about the inviolability of our constitutional rights here in Canada. That, ladies and gentlemen, you may be surprised to hear, is a complete and serious misrepresentation, misinterpretation of how our Constitution works, particularly the Charter. The Charter of Rights is sort of like the Constitutional Bill of Rights in the United States. And I think part of the problem here is that too many of our conservatives, and I'm speaking grassroots conservatives here in this country, get too much of their news and from American media, because there's very little seriously conservative media here in Canada. So if you want conservative-oriented news and discussion and debate, you tend, if you're in Canada, you tend to gravitate towards American, more or less conservative-oriented media, news sources. And so when they talk about the Constitution and constitutional rights, in the United States, the Constitution is, constitutional rights are almost inviolable. Here in Canada, that's not the case. And it's really important that our people, conservative Canadians, understand this moving forward. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada has two clauses. The first, clause number 1, or Article 1, in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the freedoms laid out in the following articles. I don't have the actual article open in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing here. And it guarantees these rights, except where a limitation of the rights, or a transgression, if you will, of those rights, can be justified in a free and democratic society. So already within the Constitution, the very first article of our Constitution, insofar as of rights are concerned, not the later stuff that has to do with how the government works, but citizens' rights, Canadians' rights, set out in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Article 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms actually spells out the conditions where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms can be set aside, if you can justify the denial of those rights, or the curtailing or curbing of those rights, as long as that curtailing is reasonable and can be demonstrably justified under or in a free and democratic society. So simply arguing that your charter rights have been violated is not enough. You have to be prepared to explain why your charter rights should not have been violated in the circumstances that they were. It's important to have those answers and to understand that dynamic here in Canada. The second thing is Section 33 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is also known as the famous or infamous, depending on one's point of view, of it's called the Notwithstanding Clause, which actually gives the power of any legislature, federal or provincial in Canada, to suspend a charter right vis-a-vis any particular piece of policy or legislation by a simple majority vote of that legislature. And that suspension lasts for 5 years, but it can be renewed. So even if you can't amply justify and demonstrate that a curtailing of the rights under the Constitution, under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada, even if you can't, if the government cannot show in a court that it is justified in suspending those rights, it could still suspend the rights by a simple act of the legislature. All right, so I only point this out because, again, I want to make sure that our people who are fighting in the public square, who are defending our rights, who are advocating for more responsible, more, what word would I be looking for here? Well, I guess responsible is the right word to use. Limited government. You have to know what you're dealing with. Okay? It's not simply a question of going to court and saying, or running around saying my charter rights have been violated, because the charter itself allows your rights to be violated. So, all right, let's move on to some international news. I'm watching the clock here. Very quickly, turns out that a secret army base reportedly has now revealed that Greenland ice vanished 416,000 years ago. And, as the headline explains, that means that it could melt way faster than was expected. Well, I don't know why people are not learning basic history. We already know that the Vikings settled sections of Greenland and had settlements and were farming in Greenland around 1,000 years ago. So I'm not going to say that Greenland had no ice 1,000 years ago, but certainly it had a lot less ice than it has today. But whatever happened 1,000 years ago or 416,000 years ago, in both cases, it was not possible for any of that melting to have occurred due to climate change that was generated by human activity. And certainly, we do know that by ice core analysis, that typically temperature changes, that is to say, increases in atmospheric temperature trends generally preceded carbon dioxide rise in the environment, in the atmosphere. So the takeaway from this is completely wrong. Everybody says, well, this shows that the ice could melt way faster than we first expected. Not entirely sure why anyone would interpret it that way, but it's irrelevant. The real takeaway here should be, and the questions that should be asked are, why, if human beings were not having the kind of impact on the environment that they have today, and why, if carbon dioxide levels were not high, why then did Greenland's ice vanish? Why was it possible for Vikings to cultivate some areas in Greenland 1,000 years ago? I leave that to you to decide what answer you want to suggest. What else is happening out there? Poland, our friendly country Poland, its birth rate has dropped to the lowest level since World War II, defying efforts by the current government to grapple with the country's aging population. Poland, of course, is not the only country. We reported last week that the same thing was happening in Japan and in a number of other countries as well. In Poland, the number of births in the year through June dropped somewhere. Let's see what I've got here. Dropped to 290,975 in the year through June, which is down 9% from the previous year, according to Poland's National Statistics Office. That trend sets a new low, and it extends a decline in the European Union's sixth largest economy, that is Poland, since 2018. The opposition parties in Poland are complaining about it, and they're accusing the government of not being very effective in its measures to reverse this trend. They are currently, the government in Poland provides a child benefit of, strike that. The Polish government is The Polish opposition is promising to boost monthly payments to families. I'm sorry, I got that a little confused. To families with children by another $200 a month from $500. So that would be $700 a month. I'm not sure if that's per child or just families with children. But clearly this isn't working. And we have child benefits, in Canada as well. And the birth rate for Canadians has continued to drop, continues to drop in the United States, continues to drop pretty much everywhere. So clearly, economic conditions, that is to say, affordability of having children, is not necessarily the deciding factor in this. All right, we've gone way beyond what we normally would like to before we go for our first break. So we're going to do that now. And when we come back, we're going to get into these hearings that occurred last week, whistleblower hearings dealing with UFOs and space travel that were held in the U.S. Congress last week. So stick around. We will be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. You are back with me, Joseph Ben-Ami. You're listening to the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Thank you so much for staying with us. Of course, as that eerie music plays, it's just a way of introducing the topic of tonight's show, the main topic, our main focus, and that is the hearing that took place, a congressional hearing before a committee that was dealing with whistleblowers. And the subject of the whistleblowers that the whistleblowers were coming forward about was an ongoing cover-up, at least one of them, the main whistleblower, we'll get into that in a second, details, but cover-up, it appears, that the federal government in the United States is engaged in with respect to what we used to just refer to as UFOs, unidentified flying objects, but now the new term, and I don't understand why we always have to come up with new terms, but now they're being referred to as UAPs, which stands for unidentified sorry, I just was looking at my notes here. Unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAPs. Unidentified anomalous phenomena. I like UFOs, of course. It rolls off the tongue a little bit better than UAPs. But anyway, that's the new term. So David Grush is a former intelligence officer who served 14 years in the Air Force and in the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And he was appearing before the House Oversight Committee on National Security, or at least the House Oversight Committee's subcommittee on national security. And he was joined in this hearing by two fighter pilots, or former fighter pilots, Ryan Graves and David Fravor. And these two fighter pilots are alleged to have firsthand experience with UAPs/UFOs. Grush is the main guy. He's really the whistleblower here. And he served as a representative on two Pentagon task forces investigating UAPs until earlier this year. He told lawmakers at the committee hearings that he was informed, quote, of a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program, end quote, during the course of his work examining classified programs. He said that he was denied access to those programs when he requested it, and he made the allegation that the military is misappropriating funds to shield these operations from congressional oversight. He said, and this is really probably the most astonishing part of his testimony, that he had interviewed officials who had direct knowledge of aircraft with, quote, non-human, end quote, origins, and that so-called, quote, biologics, end quote, were recovered from some of those craft. But he wouldn't go into very much detail. When pressed for details, he explained that he couldn't really reveal much more than he had already revealed unless he was in a closed environment and not public. So the other two who were testifying with him, they weren't really talking about whistleblowing. They were just relating their experiences, the experiences of colleagues, and they were addressing the UFO situation from an air safety point of view. Okay, so, and plus, they were also arguing that there has to be a process whereby pilots, whether in the military or civilian pilots, are able to pass on this information to a government department where they're going to be taken seriously, and whatever their observations are going to be adequately investigated, and the results of those investigations, if not made public, then at least at a minimum reported to lawmakers overseeing the overall investigations and the program. So that was the gist of what the testimony was. And, you know, it was all kind of talk around this for the past week. I had wanted to talk a little bit more about it last week, but I decided, you know, there were other issues and that I wanted to also address in a more timely fashion. And, you know, it's actually interesting that we've allowed this to percolate now for a week. Today is Tuesday. The testimony was public last Wednesday. It was carried live over the internet and on various cable networks. And I think the first observation that I would make, let's set aside for a second the credibility of the testimony and what holes there were in the testimony, if any, okay? And let's just focus for 1 minute on the public's reaction. You may recall, or you may have heard, the story of how Orson Welles in the 1930s produced a radio show that was transmitted in the United States, and it was a dramatization of the book War of the Worlds. And the War of the Worlds was about an alien invasion of the world, and people who heard this, many of them thought it was real, and it led to people fleeing from their homes, from the cities, because they had heard certain cities were being attacked or potentially going to be attacked, that they were potential targets of alien attacks. I don't know, I haven't heard or read that there were any suicides or anything like that, but it wouldn't surprise me to learn that, that had occurred as well. Perhaps in small numbers, but it just wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me that some people lost their minds over it, if I could use that terminology so crudely. And of course, the whole thing was a put on. It wasn't supposed to be a joke. It was a radio play. Remember, in those days, that was pre-television, and so dramas were done over the radio as radio plays. So a large segment of the population actually believed that this was real, and it precipitated some very panicky behavior, to the point where Orson Welles and his crew were forced to make a public apology for having precipitated all of this chaos that occurred as a consequence of that. Now, think about that for a moment, and then contrast it with what can only be characterized as a ho-hum, who cares, public response to the revelations that were made before this committee, the public revelations, and revelations that are being forwarded, promulgated as facts, not as some kind of dramatic performance for the sake of entertainment. So the officials, the three fellows who were testifying before this committee, what they were saying was, this is true. We are being, I guess the best word to use would be surveilled, reconnoitered, if you will, by extraterrestrials, by some alien life form, presumably, if Mr. Grush, if his testimony can be believed. Remember, he referred to not just non-human origins with respect to aircraft and technology, but he also referred to non-human, quote, biologics, end quote, in his testimony. And he is presenting this in a factual basis, as fact. That's his allegation. This is the nature of his whistleblowing. He's saying this is going on, and the military is misappropriating funds in order to do reverse engineering and studying of these otherworldly phenomena, and they're withholding information about this, not just from the public, but from Congress itself. And so he's the whistleblower. And then along come these two fighter pilots who are talking about their own personal experience interacting with these UAPs, UFOs, however you want to call them. And also they're relating instances where colleagues, friends, others were also reporting the same type of things. No public reaction of any significance whatsoever. Now, I just find that interesting. Is that because the public, they believe it, they're shrugging their shoulders and going, oh, you mean we're not the only life forms in the universe? Ho-hum. Tell me something new, something that I didn't already know. So is it because the public has come to accept it? Or is it because the public just generally doesn't believe it? Or here's a third option. Maybe the public didn't really hear about this. Maybe this isn't widespread information. I haven't seen any kind of data that would lead me to believe that people don't know about it, didn't know about the hearings, but it's plausible that most people just haven't heard of this. A fourth possibility is that people heard of it and, maybe they don't believe it, or it's just one more incredible conspiracy theory. I use that term kind of loosely out there, and it just seems that the world and the internet is completely full of these kinds of stories and allegations, etc. And who knows what's real and what's not real. So I don't know. I don't know what's behind the lack of public reaction to these astonishing allegations that were made public last week before this House committee in the United States. There certainly have been news reports about it. There have been a lot of news reports about it. But for some reason, the public doesn't seem to be reacting. Certainly, it's not reacting to the same degree that it would have some 80, 90 years ago when Orson Welles and his dramatic crew presented War of the Worlds on the radio in the United States. So I have to tell you that I do find that fascinating. And that's a subject completely different, completely separate from the whole question about UFOs, about UAPs. So I just don't get it. But I do think it's very interesting, and it would be interesting to study if I was doing that kind of research, but I am not. Which leads me, I think, to what has to be the overriding question here right now, and that is, how credible are these allegations? How much can we believe? How concerned should we actually be? In other words, how seriously should we be taking the allegations? How seriously should we be reacting to them? What kind of policy should we be implementing, whether we're in the United States or the United Kingdom or here in Canada where I'm living? What should we be doing about this? Are these allegations in any way, shape, or form? They're certainly serious, but should we be taking them seriously? I think that is a very important question that is going to have to be answered. But we're not going to answer it until we take our second break. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. Do not go away. And we are back here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. I'm your host, Joseph Ben-Ami. Thanks for sticking with us. We are discussing the hearings that were held a week ago. Today is Tuesday, August the 1st. Can't understand why I didn't immediately have that coming to mind. I had to think about the date for some reason. Halfway through the summer. August the 1st, 2023. And a week ago, last Wednesday, were hearings held before the National Security Subcommittee of the House Oversight Committee in the United States U.S. Congress. Whistleblowers talking about UFOs and UAPs. UAP being the new term for unidentified anomalous phenomena. Okay. And in the course of that testimony, the main whistleblower, a fellow by the name of David Grusch, who served for 14 years as an intelligence officer in the Air Force and National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, made the allegation that he had interviewed in the course of his work several officials who had direct knowledge of aircraft with, quote, non-human, end quote, origins, and that so-called, quote, biologics, end quote, were removed from some of those craft. So that's his main thing. He's talking about how this information is being covered up by the government. So that's one set of allegations. He's also suggesting, as part of that, that the military has been misappropriating funds in the United States to shield the operations, the studies, the investigations, the reverse engineering of some of this technology from congressional oversight in the United States. That, of course, is illegal. And so those are the whistleblower, quote unquote, allegations that are being made or that were made at this hearing. But essentially, I mean, the takeaway is from David Grusch's testimony is UFOs are real, and we've been covering it up for a long time. That's what we're boiling it down to. That, okay? The facts are in, as they like to say with regard to some of the other things out there. The science is settled. I don't think that's a perfectly appropriate statement to make in relation to this subject, but you get the picture. You know what I'm saying. The other two people who were with him testifying, Ryan Graves and David Fravor, are former fighter pilots in the United States, and they were describing their own personal experience observing some of these UAPs / UFOs, and also relating some of what some of their colleagues have said over the years about their own personal experiences as well. And in particular, Ryan Graves apparently is now the head of an organization that is advocating with politicians for a greater reporting mechanism, a way that pilots, both military and civilian pilots, can report this phenomena when they experience it, when they observe this, to a government department that will then investigate, make the statistics, all of the analyses that have to be done, and to make their findings public, or at a minimum, to make the findings, report findings on a regular basis to congressional committees, however that works in the United States. In a way, if we're going to really analyze the credibility of this whole thing, really, I think there are two big holes that have to be addressed. And I'm not taking a position one way or the other, by the way, on the potential existence, the reality of what's being said here. That's not my point. It's not what I want to do here. I'm completely neutral. I don't know. And I've become, when it comes to these kinds of things, as with all things that I'm seeing on the internet, I'm reading about, I'm hearing allegations, accusations, etc., I've become very skeptical. I am the king of skepticism, okay? As I tell people on this show, as you well know, we don't drink Kool-Aid here. This is a no Kool-Aid zone. So I'm not drinking anyone's Kool-Aid one way or the other. And right now, until I see evidence myself, and I can assess the credibility of the evidence myself, all of this testimony falls in the category, for me, of Kool-Aid. And I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid. Show me the evidence, and I could very well change my mind. As, again, something I like to tell people, I would rather be right than consistent. I don't think that there's any reason why you and I shouldn't change our minds on something. As I say, I'd rather be right than consistent. I'm not interested in foolish consistency. So if it turns out that what they're saying is true, then it's true. But what are they saying? Well, in the case of Ryan Graves and David Fravor, they're talking about what they saw. And I have some serious concerns about what they're saying, what they say they saw. Particularly David Fravor, who saw what has come to be known as the famous Tic Tac UFO. Tic Tac because it resembled the object that he observed, and in fairness, there were other people with him that observed the same object. Resembled a giant Tic Tac, which is like a little candy that you can get in many places in the world. And, if you're listening to this, you probably have access to the internet. So if you don't know what a Tic Tac is, Google it. And then you'll have a pretty good idea of what the shape of this particular UFO was. So he in particular described how this UFO, how it behaved. And he also, not just he, but other people, some of the other UFOs that have been out there have been described. And I'm not interested so much in the physical appearance of these as I am in the performance of them. Okay? So, what did Mr. Graves have to say? Quote, "If anyone could see the sensor and video data I witnessed, our national conversation would change," end quote. So he's talking about the performance of these particular objects. So here is what Mr. Fravor had to say about the object that he observed in 2004 off the California coast. He told the subcommittee that he and another pilot spotted the smooth, seamless, oval-shaped object hovering over the water before it rapidly climbed to 12,000 feet in the air. And by rapidly, we're talking about seconds. So, 0, accelerated, and climbed to 12,000 feet in the air within a second or two. Then, it accelerated, and it disappeared. And it was detected roughly 60 miles away in less than a minute. 60 miles in less than a minute. When he was questioned about whether or not a human being could survive the G-forces associated with that kind of acceleration, he said no. And he's quite right about that. But it's not just whether human beings can survive. It's whether any biological form can survive. Now, perhaps they can. Perhaps they can. It depends on what their biological makeup is. But we also have to be thinking about propulsion. We also have to be thinking about the physics of it. Now, I suppose I could admit, I can accept that we don't understand everything there is in physics. And so it's very possible that there is technology out there that makes this kind of mechanical behavior possible. But I don't understand what that physics is. I don't understand those physics, and I have a pretty good basic knowledge of physics because I'm educated, because I graduated high school at a time when you actually learned basic physics. So I understand things like acceleration, escape velocity, I should say. What's involved with how much energy is required to get from the Earth to escape its gravitational pull. And these guys are describing mechanical devices that go from zero at water level, sea level, to quite literally, and this is one of the things that Fravor described, out into space and then back into our atmosphere within seconds, literally. Is that credible? Is that credible? I'm a skeptic. I'm a skeptic because I don't think that we have such huge gaps in our knowledge about physics that make that really an immediately believable thing. I think if you're prepared to suspend disbelief, then you can accept that something like that could happen, but it certainly can't happen with any kind of biological life form that we are aware of here on Earth. So the physics, just the plain physics of this, makes it very difficult for me to simply accept. And that's not to say that people have not made these observations. That's to say that, in my view, the simplest explanation and the most credible explanation is that we're experiencing or we're seeing something that is not necessarily extraterrestrial. That there is something out there, there are some ways that we are able to, we see some of these phenomena. I don't want to offer an explanation, but I could easily be convinced, and I think that you could easily come up with theories that are within our technological experience, our abilities, that could explain these things other than extraterrestrial forms. But that's just me. Again, I could be wrong. I'm open-minded about these things. I just want to see. I'm not rushing to accept the testimony as it was presented. The other thing is, if you're really concerned about safety, I mean, the truth of the matter is, if you have this kind of technology, and remember, if we're talking about this kind of technology, this is not something that was invented on Mars or on the dark side of the moon. We're talking about interstellar travel. If you've got the technology to travel interstellar, then my guess is you probably have the technology to, how shall I put this, avoid crashes. So when we talk about crashes of these objects, that's another hole in the whole narrative that, makes me a little skeptical. It just seems to me that when we start talking about spacecraft crashing, capturing aliens, recovering alien bodies, when we start talking about all of this stuff, when we start talking about, safety, air safety, which presumably means avoiding mid-air collisions with UAPs, or UFOs, we'll call them in that case probably more credibly. It just seems to me that we're trying to apply, we're assuming that that these guys are somehow or other not able to avoid midair collisions, etc., or they don't have the technology to not be detected, but they could travel interstellar, or interdimensionally is another term that I heard used, I think once, maybe twice, in the testimony. Okay, so now this leads me to another interesting question, and that is, how in heaven's name are we supposed to defend ourselves against this? I mean, that's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, not going to happen in your lifetime. So if we're actually being reconnoitered for some pending alien invasion, ladies and gentlemen, well, make peace with it, my friends, because we are not going to be able to defend ourselves against this kind of an invasion. With this kind of a technology that we're up against, I mean, we are talking in comparison, if you want to contrast that technology to what we have now, it's kind of like if the aliens were where we are now, we would be back in the pre-wheel Stone Age. That's kind of where the gap is here. So when we talk about that kind of gap, when we talk about that kind of advanced technology, is it really credible? Is it really plausible that they are so far advanced, but they can't escape our radar? No sirree, Bob. I don't know. I'm a skeptic. The other thing, going back to David Grusch, and that is, when it came down to him actually talking about real facts, real evidence, other than, well, I interviewed some people who have firsthand knowledge of this, but he's basically saying is, I don't have firsthand knowledge, but I know other people that have firsthand knowledge. And he was prepared to talk about these things, but not in this hearing. He would talk about them behind closed doors, out of the public realm. I'm going, okay, whistleblowers generally don't do that, but I'm okay, I can accept it. But how are we supposed to assess the credibility of his testimony if we're not able to hear what he's saying because it's too secret? So a little red flag popped up in my head when every time he was pressed on something that I would consider to be, really, really revealing, he refused to reveal it. He gave teasers. That was it. He just gave teasers. And I have a problem with that. I just don't find that kind of testimony to be, how shall I put it, particularly credible. So, are we on the verge of being invaded by aliens? Are we being watched by aliens? How are they getting here? Through interstellar transportation. How are they making that possible? Because this isn't originating from our solar system. And if it's not originating from our solar system, it's not originating from our star, which means we are talking here about interstellar travel. Is that really plausible? Is that really credible? Or are we talking about something completely different, and that is some sort of interdimensional transportation? That would be a fascinating subject, but I'm having a lot of difficulty wrapping my mind around that as well. I don't know how you traveled from one dimension to the next dimension, but somehow or other, the craft that you're using to go from one dimension to the other, with all of this advanced technology, is still of a physical form. that I would assume if you live in a different dimension, you probably don't have quite the same kind of physical forms where you're constructing special craft where you can do that. And when and then when you get to the other dimension, again, I raise the objection of detecting these craft on your frankly antiquated Stone Age level technology like radar. I mean, we may have advanced radar and detection systems here based on our technology and where we are in scientific advancement. But, again, if we're talking multi-dimensional travel, interdimensional travel, interstellar travel, it just seems really hard for me. It's just hard for me to believe that there isn't something else going on here. And I'm not going to speculate what the something else is, but it's hard for me to believe that any advanced technology like that would be so easily detected. Anyway, what can you do, ladies and gentlemen? I just don't have an answer. All right, normally at this time we would go for a break and then we would come back and do a short Today in History segment, but we've gone a little bit over time today. So in keeping with our desire to keep our show at approximately an hour, we're going to forego the privilege of doing a third, I should say, commercial break. And we're going to skip tonight This Week in History, because I think we've covered pretty much everything. I mean, let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, if everything that was put forward by these whistleblowers last Wednesday testifying before the committee in the United States, if everything they're saying is true, why do we care what happened on this day in history? Of course, I don't necessarily agree with that assessment. That's not my personal view, but I suppose one really does have to consider it. Anyway, thank you so much for joining in. As always, check out the website, ladies and gentlemen, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. While you're there, check out our recommended reading. Don't be afraid to give me or any of our people who are assisting in the production of this show some recommendations as to what you think the people should be reading. And we will take a look at it. And if we like your suggestion, we'll post them. What else? Well, you're there. Don't forget to sign up for our free email updates. And hey, listen, if you're listening to this show or watching this show on Rumble or on YouTube, click on the subscribe button. It costs you nothing. When you subscribe, all you're doing is you're just saying that you want to be notified when there is a new episode posted or a new episode pending. So it costs you nothing. Do please subscribe. All right. Well, that's it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Join us again tomorrow night here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show, where we speak truth to power without drinking Kool-Aid. And I can't think of anything else that I want to say for this evening. All right. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen. We'll catch you tomorrow night here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show.